Thank you. Good to be here. And just to start with, I was thinking while we were listening to Dilwan, a quotation from the Holy Quran came to mind. O people, we have formed you from a male and a female, and have formed you into tribes and nations, so that you may get to know one another. Now that is the task of our time. We're living in a globalized world, whether we like it or not. We've created a market, global market, where our economies are profoundly interdependent, so that when stocks fall in one part of the world, they plummet all around the globe that day. We're intertwined politically. What happens in Pakistan or Afghanistan or today can have repercussions in New York or London tomorrow. We're linked electronically on the World Wide Web. And yet, the more global we become, the more people, in a sense of insecurity, tend to retreat into tribes and nations. The nation state was probably one of the bad ideas of the 19th century. It would have been impossible before modern communications to create a sense of nationality, nationism. How could people living up in the north of England, people who never went 20 miles from their home, feel they had anything in common with people living in the Isle of Wight? But now modern communications have built up this sense of nationhood. But, very early, Lord Acton, the British historian in the late 19th century, pointed out that nationalism had a fatal flaw. He said that the emphasis in nationhood on ethnicity, culture, and language would make it very dangerous for people who did not fit the national profile. In some cases, he said, they could even be enslaved or exterminated. And it was not long after that the Young Turks, in order to create a purely Turkic state, massacred over 1 million Armenians. And then the Holocaust, the ultimate inability to accept ethnic minorities, Bosnia. And we have to resist, and you have it in the Holy Quran, this desire to retreat into tribes and nations. It happens religiously too. Modernization, globalization has the more globally we think about religion, the more we see the profound interconnections, as well as the fascinating differences between the different religious traditions, the more some people, feeling threatened by this, retreat into kind of denominational ghettos and build up new reserves against the other. I think we have to recognize this comes from deep fear and insecurity, as well as just pure nastiness. There's long been a hostility towards Islam in the West, ever since the time of the Crusades, when Islam was a great world power and was often resented in the way people resent the United States today. It was during the time of the Crusades, interestingly, when it was Western Christians launching a quite unprovoked and appalling attack on the Muslim world, that the idea grew up in the West, promoted by monkish historians in the 12th, 13th century, that Islam was an inherently violent religion. Almost a projection. They must have realized at some level that this was an un-Christian thing to do. Jesus had, after all, told his followers to love their enemies, not to exterminate them. You have a sense of projection of your own guilt onto the other whom you have harmed. And so denial is a big part of Western attitudes towards Islam, I think. We saw it in the Paris March. There were all those leaders marching arm in arm for freedom of expression, for freedom, liberté, and yet some of those leaders, including David Cameron, had for decades, in the case of Britain for nearly a century, supported regimes in Muslim-majority countries that allowed their people no freedom of expression. And a complete denial of this. Denial is an unhealthy attitude. And that is what British people, American people are struggling with today. But things aren't all bad. I mean, ghastly as they are, it was heartening that the day after Trump's election, there were demonstrations from people all over the world. Again, an outcry against this. But these are difficult times. But they are also, times of great difficulty can also be a time of great creativity. And I think Dilwan spoke so eloquently about this, that instead of being defensive and embattled about this, I want to look back, perhaps, at a few incidents in Muslim history where things have looked very, very black indeed. And yet this was precisely the moment when Islam took great, important spiritual as well as political leaps forward. Because this is in the Muslim DNA. Religion's often been called a chain of memory. We often look at the past to help to invigorate and illuminate the present, the confused present. And let's just look at a few moments of great trauma and distress in the Muslim past, which have been moments of great depth and insight. Let's start with Hijrah. We are so used to the story of the migration from Makkah up to Yathrib in the north, that we don't always realize what an enormity that incident and that the need to do this must have been. In 7th century Arabia, the tribe was a sacred value. It was probably the most sacred value in the peninsula, much more than the gods in many ways. It was unthinkable that one should leave one's own tribe and take up residence with people with whom one had no blood link. It was, and the word hijra, the root, indicates this sense of terrible separation. It says he parted from him irrevocably. It was unheard of, something utterly new. And that, not the day that the first revelations came to the prophet, peace be upon him, not the date of the prophet's birth, but this moment of extraordinary upheaval and departure from the old and traumatic severance from everything that was held sacred. So you felt you were violating a sacred value. This is the start of the Muslim era. The Muslim era dates from this moment of absolute innovation. And of course it was the beginning of bringing peace to war-torn Arabia, and to bringing Islam into more complications, the complications of running a state, which inevitably brings about fighting and warfare and questions of the economy, but taking all that on and moving forward creatively into the future. And then we look at the great fitna, two of them. And we talk about this glibly, but these were terrible times. The companions of the Prophet were fighting and killing one another. Ali was killed. Uthman killed. Muslims at war. The terrible massacre of Hussein and his family by a Muslim caliph. And also the huge ideological problem of the empire. And empires, however benign they might claim to be, are always based on violence and inequality. That was the theme of my book, Fields of Blood. Every single pre-modern empire, which was based on an aristocracy which comprised about 5% of the population, and the rest were subjugated and made to live at subsistence level. And no society, no empire, no civilization found an alternative to this iniquitous setup. But historians of religion tell us, not leave out religion, historians tell us that without this terrible system, humanity probably would not have progressed beyond a primitive level, because it created a privileged class which had the leisure to develop the arts and sciences on which our progress developed. And now here were Muslims in charge of one of these terrible things. How are you going to sort of countenance this when the message of the Quran is about equality, about sharing, about giving what you have, about it being wrong to build a private fortune when others are poor? And Muslims didn't just say, oh, well, that's just one of those things, nothing we can do about it. They went into study groups. And from those study groups, intense discussions, developed many of the spiritualities that are so central to Islam today. Fiqh, for example. As people tried to develop a jurisprudential system that would enable people to think through the Quran and apply it to the circumstances, the new circumstances of the day. Sufism. The whole Sufi tradition began with, it seems to be, a revolt against the luxury of the caliphal court. A return to the simplicity and ascetical traditions of the very first Ummah. The Shia, with its a cry for protest, a call, a piety of protest it's been called, reminding Muslims of every year on the festival of Hussein's martyrdom of the injustice in mainstream Muslim society, reminding us what, as the Quran says, be a reminder. Human beings are not bad, they're just forgetful. What we need is a reminder. 100 years after the Prophet's death, peace be upon him, he probably would not have recognized the Ummah. It had changed so much. And yet it had responded from that pain, from that upheaval, in a creative way. It's a struggle, it's a jihad, the true meaning of jihad, the struggle to make your tradition, a tradition of compassion and equality, speak as best it can in a broken world. And then let's fast forward a few centuries to the Mongols. Desperate devastation. And no sooner were they getting rid of the Crusaders, assaulting them from the west, then the Mongol hordes descended on the east. Swathes of destruction, whole cities massacred, whole libraries destroyed. And out of this comes two things. First, you have a spiritual revival. Rumi was a refugee from the Mongols. And his spirituality was definitely influenced by the vast horizons that the Mongols had in their minds. They knew no boundaries. And Rumi applied that to the spiritual world, encouraging his followers, his Sufi followers, to adopt a similar outreach towards other peoples, other religious faiths, and expand their spiritual horizons in new ways. And then you have the creation of the three empires, three more Muslim empires, the Ottoman, the Safavid, and the Mughal, or the Mongol Empire, which were very strongly influenced by the Mongol army state, but using that to create the most up-to-date and highly developed states in the world. Again, with all the problems of statehood. We now, all of us, have to start looking at our traditions. Don't let me think for one moment that I'm telling you that you need a reformation and you haven't had one before. It's one of these ridiculous remarks that Western people make, because they've got into the habit in the West of thinking of some 16th century events, the Reformation, they call it, the Protestant Reformation, is some kind of unique event in world history. It was important, but simply because it coincided with the birth of the modern period. And it was modernizing Christianity in sometimes in problematic ways. But Reformation is constant in every tradition. It doesn't mean that there's something drastically wrong, as people like Luther said with the Catholic Church. Of course, it had its faults. But that we constantly have to look at the present and make a creative effort or struggle to apply it. Apply our sacred ideals to this. And it's not easy. It's been well said that every religious tradition is a kind of dialogue, a constant dialogue between an eternal truth and constantly changing realities on the ground. And the struggle is to make your tradition speak to these particular circumstances. We need somehow to think outside the box. For the last few years, every time there's been some kind of terrorist attack, we come forth and say, well, Islam is a peaceful religion, etc. And, somehow this is not going down well. We have to show it somehow, find ways, creative ways outside the box of making that clear to people. And the West needs a reformation right now at the moment, too. It has, I begin to think that we're looking something at the end of Western hegemony. I'm a historian, and you see this so often at the end of empires. Think of the Roman Empire, for example. You see a similar set of events. Wars undertaken that can't be won. Economies getting out of hand, failing or falling into debt. And the appointment of insane rulers. I'm thinking of, I'm not thinking of the White House at this precise moment, but I have got Nero and Caligula in mind. And this was the sign of the end. All good things, or bad things, depending on how you look at Western hegemony. And I speak as a British person, but also an Irish person who has there was a long, unhappy history, of course, between Britain and Ireland. This is a troubling time. And it's when things are breaking up that people, as I said at the beginning, retreat into these denominational ghettos. And we spoke of compassion at the beginning. You told about my charter. And I get furious sometimes with my charter people because they may be wanting to create a city of compassion, for example. They want their city to be nice. They don't. I say my plan is that we should link up some of these cities so that we have a city dedicated to compassion like Louisville in Kentucky, teaming up or twinning with, say, a city in Pakistan or the Middle East. And so that people and the students can exchange news and emails and have friendships, news can be exchanged, visits promoted, and gradually some of these misapprehensions we have one another can be broken down. No one wants to do it. I have to say the Muslims are up for it, but in the West, I put it to the mayor of Louisville, and he said, he's a multimillionaire, big businessman. He said, I don't see the return. But the return is world peace. Because unless compassion, as Dilwan said at the beginning, it's not just a nice idea about lovey-doveyness. And there was a city in Europe declared itself a compassionate city. I'm not going to tell you which one. And they asked me if I'd do a sort of video to say, well done. And I said, why? What am I congratulating for? We haven't done anything yet. And they said, well, they want a pat on the back, etc. And they were saying they want you to help them deal with their pain. Pain, I said. It was a time when the refugee crisis was at its height. These people are living the life of Riley compared to most people in the world. Think of the pain of others. You see, unless now, the golden rule, as the prophet, peace be upon him, said, not one of you can be a believer unless he desires for his neighbour what he desires for himself. That is not just a nice idea. Unless now we ensure that all peoples, whoever they are, whether we like them or not, or approve of them or not, are treated as we would wish to be treated ourselves, the world is simply not going to be a viable place. And so this is an urgent imperative. And somehow we have to make that not just a nice little slogan, but a living reality. Especially you younger people, because you are living in the electronic age and you will be far more adroit at handling this new reality, living with it and making it work creatively instead of in a menacing way than my generation can ever hope to be. And the electronic age is going to affect profoundly the way we think, the way we read or listen to our traditions. It's already having the disastrous effect of the tweeting, which has become so notorious recently from certain quarters. But it's giving people the impression that you can sum up a complex idea in 140 characters. It's encouraging a dumbing down. As a former Catholic, I never thought I'd hear myself saying these words, but I really quite admire what the Pope is doing at the moment. He does write some good encyclicals, but he acts. He knows how to use the media to make a point. When he went to Palestine and Israel, for example, he was escorted to the Yad Vashem, which is the Holocaust Memorial Museum. And while he was there, he went to the wall of the museum and laid his head in penitence and sorrow against that wall, in penitence for what had been done to those 6 million Jews. They then escorted him to the Western Wall, where Jews, it's often called the Wailing Wall, where Jews weep for the past. And again, he went and leant against the wall in prayer and sorrow and contrition. And then Mr. Netanyahu escorted him to the wall that has been built between Israel and Palestine. And while he was explaining that this had been tremendous and had cut down on a lot of terrorism, in the middle of this discourse, the Pope went and laid his head in contrition against that wall too. And that picture went out immediately around. And after the the predecessor, the last pope, who was not exactly a friend to the Muslim people, that it shifted perceptions. We need to use perhaps less words, more images, more pictures. That's what I'm talking about, thinking outside the box, to get across that message that all our faiths stand for, that religion consists not in saying your prayers nicely, although that's important, but in getting rid of the ego by putting yourself in the position of another, day by day, hour by hour, looking into your own heart, discovering what gives you pain, and then refusing under any circumstance whatsoever to inflict that pain on anybody else. That is the task for our time. And I really think this is a very important day. You're going to have two very important days. People from different parts, positions in the Muslim world, coming together and thinking, what can we do? How can we do this? This can be a creative seedbed, like those discussion groups that were created at the time of the fitna. And I finish a lot of my talks with a quotation from Ibn Arabi. And he's talking about religious difference and religious difference and how you mustn't abandon religious chauvinism. But I think it can apply equally to any kind of ideology or any kind of stance. We're filled often with such righteousness in our discourse. We don't question ourselves enough. We need to recognize the profound ignorance and how little we know. And how little we know at this moment in history before the immensity of the problems that seem to face us. He said this: "Do not praise your own faith so exclusively that you disbelieve all the rest. If you do this, you will miss much good. Nay, you fail to recognize the real truth of the matter. God, the omnipresent and omniscient, cannot be confined to any one creed. For he says in the Quran, 'Wheresoever ye turn, there is the face of Allah.' Everybody praises what he knows. His God is his own creature, and in praising it, he praises himself. Consequently, he blames the beliefs of others, which he would not do if he were just, but his dislike is based on ignorance." Thank you.